What do you do when enemy cameras are pointed at you, forcing you to say things that betray everything you believe in? For Navy pilot Jeremiah Denton, the answer came down to something as simple as blinking. But the message he sent would shake the world. The morning of July 18, 1965, started like any other combat mission for Commander Jeremiah Denton. The 41-year-old Navy pilot from Mobile, Alabama, kissed the small photograph of his wife Jane that he kept tucked in his flight helmet before climbing into the cockpit of his A-6 Intruder. His mission: a bombing run over North Vietnam. He had no idea this would be the last time he'd taste freedom for 7.5 years. 20 minutes into the mission, everything went wrong. Surface-to-air missiles screamed up from the jungle canopy below. Denton felt the sickening lurch as his aircraft was hit, the controls going dead in his hands. "We're going down," he radioed, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. The ejection sequence was a blur of explosive bolts and rushing wind, and then he was floating down under his parachute, watching his burning aircraft spiral into the Vietnamese countryside. The capture was swift and brutal. Denton had barely hit the ground when North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from the jungle like ghosts. They stripped him of his survival gear, bound his hands with rough rope, and began the long march to what would become his home. For the next 2,847 days, First Prison was a concrete box barely large enough for a man to lie down. The heat was suffocating, the humidity so thick it felt like drowning in slow motion. But the physical conditions were nothing compared to what came next. His captors had a simple goal: break this American pilot completely, then parade him before the world as proof that even their strongest warriors could be reduced to propaganda tools. The interrogations began immediately. Day after day, Denton was dragged from his cell to face a rotating cast of North Vietnamese officers. They wanted military intelligence, flight patterns, target lists, anything that could help them shoot down more American aircraft. When he refused to talk, the real torture began. They called it the rope trick. Denton's arms were bound behind his back with rough hemp rope, then yanked upward until his shoulders threatened to dislocate. For hours, he would hang suspended in agony, the rope cutting deep grooves into his flesh. When that didn't work, they moved to the leg irons, metal shackles that held his legs in an impossible spread position for days at a time. But perhaps the cruelest torture was the sleep deprivation. For weeks on end, his captors would wake him every few minutes, just as he was drifting off to sleep. The human mind, Denton learned, can endure almost anything except the complete absence of rest. Hallucinations began to creep in. He would see his wife Jane standing in the corner of his cell, only to have her vanish when he tried to speak. Through it all, Denton held to one unbreakable principle: name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Nothing more. No matter how much they hurt him, no matter how they threatened him, he would give them nothing that could harm his fellow Americans. But by early 1966, something had shifted in his captors' strategy. The torture continued, but now they had a new demand. They wanted him to appear on camera. Not just to confess to war crimes. They wanted him to denounce American policy, to call for an end to the bombing, to become the poster boy for their anti-war propaganda. You will read this script. His primary interrogator, a thin man with dead eyes whom the prisoners had nicknamed Bug, told him one gray morning in May. The script was typewritten on thin paper, the English awkward but clear. It praised the humane treatment of American prisoners and condemned the criminal aggression of the United States. "I will not," Denton replied, his voice barely a whisper after months of abuse. Bug smiled coldly. "You will. Because if you do not, we will bring in your friend Lieutenant Commander McCain, and we will make you watch what we do to him." John McCain had been shot down 4 months after Denton. The young pilot had arrived at the prison camp with 2 broken arms and a broken leg, injuries his captors had deliberately left untreated. Denton had listened to McCain's screams echoing through the concrete walls during his own torture sessions. The thought of being responsible for more suffering inflicted on his fellow prisoner was unbearable. 3 days later, Denton found himself sitting in front of television cameras in a small, stifling room in downtown Hanoi. The lights were blazing hot, making sweat pour down his face. North Vietnamese officials stood just out of camera range, their eyes fixed on him with predatory intensity. A Japanese journalist, one of the few foreign correspondents allowed into North Vietnam, held a microphone toward him. Denton had spent those 3 days in his cell thinking. He knew he was going to have to read the script. The alternative was watching his friends suffer even more. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this propaganda victory into something else entirely. He had learned Morse code in flight school, like every Navy pilot. It was basic training, drilled into them until it became second nature. 3 dots for S, 3 dashes for O, the international distress signal. But Morse code wasn't just dots and dashes. It could be anything. Light flashes, sound patterns, even blinks. As the cameras began to roll, Denton straightened his shoulders as much as his injured body would allow. He looked directly into the camera lens, knowing that somewhere, somehow, this footage would make its way back to America. Back to Jane. Back to people who might understand. "I get so confused when I think of America," he began, reading from the script his captors had forced him to memorize. His voice was flat, emotionless, the words clearly coerced. But his eyes blink, pause, blink, 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 pause, blink, T. "Sometimes when I think of how I was directed to bomb hospitals and schools." Blink, 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 pause, blink, 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 pause, blink, blink, blink. "Oh, I get confused and I think, what did I do?" Blink, pause, blink, 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 pause, blink. The interview continued for 17 agonizing minutes. Denton read every word they demanded, his voice never wavering from that dead, coerced monotone. But through it all, his eyelids kept moving in that careful, deliberate pattern. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, he had spelled out the complete word: TORTURE. The footage was broadcast throughout North Vietnam that same day, then distributed to international media outlets. The North Vietnamese were ecstatic. Here was an American pilot, a career military officer, admitting to war crimes and praising his captors' humane treatment. But 8,000 miles away, in a small office in the Pentagon's intelligence wing, a sharp-eyed analyst named Louise Mulligan was watching the same footage with growing unease. Mulligan had been working in naval intelligence for 15 years. She had a reputation for catching details that others missed, for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Something about the Denton interview bothered her, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on what. She played the footage again, this time with the sound off, focusing entirely on Denton's face. The man was clearly in terrible physical condition. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin pale and splotchy. But there was something else, something about the way he blinked. She played the footage again, this time with the sound off, focusing entirely on Denton's face. The man was clearly in terrible physical condition. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin pale and splotchy. But there was something else. Something about the way he blinked. On her third viewing, Mulligan began counting. The blinks weren't random. They came in clusters, with distinct pauses between each cluster, and the pattern repeated itself throughout the interview. Her heart began to race. She grabbed a pad of paper and began transcribing. Cluster 1. Single blink, cluster 2. 3 blinks, cluster 3. Single blink, cluster 4. 3 blinks, cluster 5. 3 blinks, cluster 6. Single blink, 1 short, 3 long, 1 short, 3 long, 3 long, 1 short, dot dash dot, dash dash dash, dot dash dot, TOR. Oh my God, she whispered. Mulligan's hands shook as she continued transcribing. When she had decoded the complete message, she stared at the paper in stunned silence for a full minute. Then she picked up her secure phone and dialed her supervisor's direct line. Sir, you need to get down here right now. We have a problem. Or maybe we have a miracle. Within an hour, a dozen of the Pentagon's top intelligence analysts were crowded into Mulligan's small office, watching the Denton footage over and over again. The room was electric with tension as they confirmed what Mulligan had discovered. He's telling us he's being tortured, whispered Admiral James Stockdale's intelligence liaison. Right there on camera, while they're making him say he's being treated well, he's telling us the truth. The implications were staggering. For months, North Vietnam had been insisting to international observers that American prisoners were being treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They had even allowed selected prisoners to write carefully monitored letters home, letters that spoke of adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment. But now they had proof that it was all lies. Commander Jeremiah Denton, using nothing more than the blink of his eyes, had managed to communicate the brutal reality of his captivity while his captors stood right beside him, completely unaware of what he was doing. The footage became a diplomatic weapon. Within days, copies were being shown to representatives from neutral countries, to Red Cross officials, to journalists who had been parroting North Vietnamese claims about prisoner treatment. The carefully constructed propaganda narrative began to crumble. More importantly, the intelligence allowed American negotiators to push harder for prisoner welfare during the long, drawn-out Paris peace talks. They now had irrefutable evidence to counter North Vietnamese denials about torture and abuse. But perhaps the most important audience for Denton's message was much smaller and more personal. In Norfolk, Virginia, Jane Denton sat in her living room and watched her husband's face on the evening news. She had been told that Jeremiah was alive, that he was being held prisoner, but for 7 months she had received no word about his condition or treatment. Now, seeing his gaunt face and haunted eyes, she knew the truth was far worse than the official statements suggested. But she also saw something else in those eyes: defiance. Even under unimaginable pressure, her husband was still fighting, still finding ways to serve his country and communicate with her. She paused the recording on her home video player, a new technology that allowed her to study her husband's face frame by frame. She couldn't decode Morse code herself, but she didn't need to. The message was clear in every line of his face, every careful blink. I am alive. I am resisting. I have not given up. That night, Jane Denton wrote in her diary, "Today I saw my husband for the first time in 7 months. He looked terrible, but his spirit is unbroken. Somehow I know he was trying to tell me something. I know he was trying to tell us all something." Back in his concrete cell in Hanoi, Denton had no way of knowing whether his message had been received or understood. The guards had seemed pleased with his performance, slapping him on the back and even giving him a slightly larger portion of rice that evening. As far as they knew, their propaganda coup had been flawless. But Denton knew better. Somewhere, someone would notice the pattern. Someone would understand. And even if they didn't, even if his message disappeared into the void, he had done something. He had fought back in the only way available to him. He had turned their moment of victory into his act of resistance. The torture continued for years after the interview. Bug and his colleagues seemed determined to break every American prisoner completely, to erase every trace of defiance from their spirits. But something had shifted after that day in front of the cameras. Word of Denton's courage spread through the prison camp's whispered communication network, passed from cell to cell through coded taps on walls and carefully orchestrated meetings in the exercise yard. If Commander Denton could find a way to fight back while sitting in front of enemy cameras, then maybe there were other ways to resist. Maybe the human spirit was stronger than their captors believed. 7.5 years after his capture, on February 12, 1973, Commander Jeremiah Denton walked off a transport plane at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. He was one of 591 American prisoners of war released as part of Operation Homecoming, the final chapter of America's involvement in Vietnam. As he stepped onto the tarmac, his legs shaky from years of confinement, Denton was handed a microphone. Television cameras surrounded him, but this time they were American cameras, operated by American journalists, recording his words for an American audience that had waited years to hear them. "We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances," he said, his voice stronger now than it had been in that Hanoi studio 7 years earlier. "We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America." But as the cameras captured his emotional homecoming, Denton couldn't help but think about that day in 1966, about those 17 minutes when he had turned his captor's propaganda victory into his own small act of defiance. Later, when reporters asked him about the interview and the blinking code, he would smile and say simply, "I was trying to confirm for intelligence people that we were being tortured." It was a typical understatement from a man who had just accomplished one of the most extraordinary acts of covert communication in military history. The story of Jeremiah Denton's blinking code became legend in military intelligence circles, studied and admired by generations of officers who marveled at his ingenuity and courage. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came years later, when Denton himself had become a successful businessman and politician, serving as a United States Senator from Alabama. In 1982, Senator Denton received a letter from a young Navy pilot who was about to deploy to a dangerous posting overseas. The pilot had heard the story of the blinking code and wanted Denton to know how much it meant to him. In 1982, Senator Denton received a letter from a young Navy pilot who was about to deploy to a dangerous posting overseas. The pilot had heard the story of the blinking code and wanted Denton to know how much it meant to him. "Your example," the young pilot wrote, "shows us that no matter how impossible the situation seems, there's always a way to fight back. There's always a way to serve your country and stay true to your principles. Thank you for showing us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as quiet as a blink." Denton kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his life, a reminder that the simplest acts of defiance can echo through history, inspiring others to find their own ways to stand up for what they believe in.